What's up, everyone? We always tackle those huge what-if questions on this channel, right? But today, I want to experience that era myself. Hold on. Forget your phone, running water, and even aspirin. What would your life actually be like if you were born in the Middle Ages? Let's jump into a time machine and simulate my short, tough life in the 14th century. Buckle up, because this simulation is going to get a bit dirty. For me, the story began in the cold winter of 1315, in a small, unremarkable village. My entire life's destiny was determined right then. I was a serf. That means I belonged to my lord, bound to the land. I had neither freedom nor choice. If I had been born a noble, my life would have been completely different. Castles, feasts, and the right to literacy. But I was unlucky. My world was one of millions, with muddy shoes and hardened hands, seeking breadcrumbs on the Lord's land. Even the lives of the artisans behind the city walls seemed like heaven to me. The only reality for me was that I had to be in the Lord's field by morning. My life in the village was truly a brutal gamble. My only security was the success of the next harvest. Therefore, the main axis of my life was wheat. It was barley. Even while sleeping at night, I would check if it was raining. Winter, however, literally meant death. The cold, malnutrition, and a constant sense of hunger slowly wore down my body. The small plot of land the Lord left me, which was considered a blessing, was insufficient to feed my whole family. Keeping the animals indoors in winter, the smell of damp straw, the fear that an entire year's labor could be wiped out by a single storm. The only thing we were told was, keep working and pray. For me, there was no prosperity, only survival. My typical day began long before the rooster crowed. I had to be in the field, turning the soil with the plow, by sunrise. Think about it, no tractor, no right to rest. After working on the Lord's land all day, I would return to my small plot and continue working there. Every part of my body ached, my joints, my back, my hands. Even though I was only in my 20s, I felt like I was 60. For me, food was just for sustenance. Bland oat, gruel, maybe some dry bread, no meat, no sugar. I was the living machine of the Middle Ages, programmed only to meet the demands of the Lord and the land. In my life, there was no concept of a weekend or vacation. My greatest fear was getting injured. For me, a simple cut, an infection that could be handled with antibiotics today, easily meant death. I remember once, I lightly cut my foot with an axe. The old woman in the village, what I called the healer, gave me a mixture made of herbs and sheep dung. Yes, you heard that right, dung, science, hygiene. These didn't exist in my world. For me, illnesses were the work of evil spirits or God's wrath. If you had a toothache, the only person who might pull your tooth was perhaps the local barberand without anesthesia. Our average life expectancy was short. Reaching the age of 40 was considered a great achievement. I lived with a constant potential for pain and injury. In my world, there was no concept of cleanliness, so I was constantly ill. Those living in the city had it even worse. Even in our village, the difference between our barn and our living quarters was minimal. Waste, both human and animal, was thrown into the street. When it rained, I had to walk through that muddy sludge to reach the field. Even our spring water was often impure. That's why drinking beer or wine was a safer alternative than water. This continuous filth was the main source of the intestinal diseases and fevers that weakened me every year. Even a tiny germ we complain about today had the power to instantly end my life. For me, hygiene was a luxury that could only be dreamed of. Literacy. Oh, That was a noble privilege for me. For a serf like me, education was limited to knowing how to hold the plow in the field. My father taught me the language of the soil, when to sow and when to harvest. My books were the mud of the field and the sky. When the priest at the church read something in Latin, I understood nothing, but it was important because it was the word of God. Knowledge and the ability to understand the world were monopolies held by the nobility and the church. I couldn't even read a letter, so I couldn't question how much tax the Lord was imposing on me. My life was defined by simple, verbal rules told to me. I have to be honest, sometimes I wished I were an artisan instead. Behind the city walls, a little further from the mud, the life of a blacksmith or a shoemaker seemed more dignified. It was a better chance than being a serf. If my father had managed to escape the Lord and place me as an apprentice in the city, my life could have completely changed. An artisan could become the master of their own craft. I would have a house, a shop, and perhaps I could even eat meat during certain times of the year. But this was an escape, and very few of us dared to try it. My destiny was chained to the field. The rhythmic sounds made by the blacksmith's hammer were just a distant dream. My dream of an artisan's life, the guild system, also had its own set of strict rules. As an apprentice, I would have to work for years without pay. Then I would become a journeyman, meaning I would get paid, but still couldn't establish my own business. Finally, when I became a master, I could open my own shop. Guilds controlled quality and prices. This was a structure and safety net that a serf like me could never have. If I had succeeded in this system, I would have belonged to one of the most respected groups after the church. The guild meant not only trade, but also social insurance. But I learned to swing a scythe in the mud, not a sword for a journeyman's project. My mastery achievement was to achieve the best harvest. Aside from hunger and the Lord's oppression, the greatest power and fear in my life was the church. It was at the center of everything. On Sundays, even though I was tired, I had to be at church. The priest would tell me about the reward of heaven and the eternal torment of hell. For me, this world was just a test. The real life would begin after death. We were told that our suffering had meaning and that our obedience to the Lord was God's command. This faith was the only thing that kept me tied to life. Superstitions were common. The rituals we performed to ward off evil spirits were as important as the official rules of religion. My entire life was dedicated to preparing for the next one. While struggling with the mud in the field, sometimes my eyes would catch the Lord's soldiers passing by on the road. There was only one way to escape the harsh life most of us knew: becoming a soldier. For me, this was the dream of escaping serfdom by serving the Lord, or better yet, earning some gold as a mercenary. Their armor shone, they had plenty of food, and at least they had a purpose. If there wasn't a chance my family would starve, perhaps I would try to run away and wield a spear. A knight's life was so far removed from our misery, it was as if they were on another planet. But I knew this attractive life came with a heavy cost, the possibility of an instant and brutal death. If I had succeeded in becoming a soldier, I would quickly learn the terrible truth beneath that shining armor. War was not romantic like in the songs. It meant cold, filth, and terror. Participating in a siege meant spending months outside, ravaged by disease and hunger. Those moments were far worse than working on the Lord's land. An enemy arrow could take my life at any moment, or a sword strike could leave me disabled. Disability was a slow and certain death for me, as I couldn't return to the field. All the supposed honor in soldiering ended the moment an arrow was fired. Soldiers were just like me, fearful people trying to survive in a different way. My life was hard, but if I had been born a woman, the rules would have been even stricter. A woman's life was subject to the authority of her father, and then her husband. There were no property rights. Her sole purpose was to marry and bear children. My mother lived with the exhaustion of giving birth almost every year, because a child meant an extra pair of hands for the Lord's field. However, every birth endangered my mother's life. In my eyes, women undertook both the labor at home and worked as much as men in the field, yet they never received the same respect. They were the silent heroes of the social structure, sustaining life with their fertility and labor. Even though my life was a constant struggle, sometimes we took short breaks. Our greatest entertainment was the church's holy days and the harvest festivals. On that day, the Lord would show a little mercy, providing us with better food and plenty of ale. That was when we would forget, for a moment, that we were serfs. We would gather in the village square, sing simple songs, and perhaps watch the comical imitations of a local jester. Dancing was the moment I felt closest to freedom. These feasts were a kind of psychological fuel to endure the next tough year. No theater, no books, just instantaneous, simple, and communal joy. Those small, cheerful moments were enough to alleviate the pain of the whole year. Leaving my village was a dangerous and rare occurrence. If I were a merchant, my world would be vast. They were at least free. But travel also brought its own dangers. The roads were poor, bridges were dangerous, and bandits could ambush you at every turn. Merchants had to pay high customs duties every time they crossed a lord's border. Because of these taxes, it was impossible for a peasant like me to taste an exotic spice. For me, trade was only exchanging a few eggs I raised in the village's small market. The stories of distant lands told by merchants were just fairy tales for me. Places I would never see, only dream about. The biggest and most annoying reality of my life was the Lord's will. Everything I worked for belonged to Him first. At harvest time, the Lord's share was taken first. This was called tax, but it was an obligation. I had to give Him a large portion, sometimes half, of the crop. On top of that, I was paying a separate fee just to use the Lord's mill and to use the wine press. My labor meant His wealth. If the Lord wished, He could impose more corvée unpaid labor on us. Every moment I spent working in my own field, I was essentially repaying my debt to the Lord. Living at the whim of the Lord meant I didn't know what freedom was. For me, law was what came out of the Lord's mouth. There was no written constitution and no impartial judge. If a dispute arose, the decision would be made by the Lord or His appointee. Therefore, it was impossible for a serf like me to win a case against the Lord's men. Justice was often public, swift, and brutal. The execution of a thief or a rebel was carried out in the village square to teach the populace a lesson. For me, the law was a whip I had to obey, not a shield that protected me. Survival meant following the rules and never angering the Lord. Even if I managed to survive all these hardships, a nightmare like the Black Death that emerged around 1347 was waiting for me. The disease took not only my neighbor, but also my family. No one knew what was happening. Some said it was God's wrath, while others claimed it was bad air or planetary alignment. Despair and panic spread everywhere. Villages were emptied. For me, this meant constantly living face to face with death. Strangely, an advantage also arose for the survivors after the plague, because the workforce diminished. The lords were forced to offer better terms to the remaining peasants, but I could never forget the fear I felt during those days. For me, life was merely a short transit. I lacked knowledge and literacy, But I had a strong belief. True happiness was not in this world, but in the afterlife. The suffering in this world purified my soul. This resignation and fatalism was my greatest solace. During my short lifespan of an average of 35 to 40 years, my sole goal was to please God and follow the rules of the church. Death, for me, was not a frightening end, but a beginning where the pain and the Lord's oppression ended, and I would find true peace. In the modern world, people chase careers and money. I was only chasing the next harvest and heaven. So that was my simulated life as a serf born in the Middle Ages. Dirty, short, and completely controlled by someone else. After this tough journey, I can't express in words how much I appreciate my warm shower today and the phone in my hand. Which historical period do you think we should go to for our next video? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this alternate history journey, please don't forget to subscribe and like the video. See you in the next adventure. Take care.